I'm asked sometimes to explain my process of creating the challenge runs I post to this channel. I never quite know how to answer these questions, considering it just amount to I sit down, practice, try my best after pressing record, then bam, you've got a no damage run. But that's a pretty boring answer, so let me rephrase these questions into one that I'm sure better articulates what's being requested of me. How do you make a run worth watching? There, I think I can answer that better, because no damage runs or even minimalist runs are standard challenges, and nowadays they're pretty boring for a viewer to watch without any sort of novelty aspect being implemented. The whole theme of my challenge runs is playing with style, which was inspired from the Devil May Cry series. So I guess I can show off a sample of how I typically tackle a stage, how I take stage design into consideration when determining what's more entertaining to watch versus what's practical or expected, and how often I break up the stages in sections to better optimize what I'm typically aiming to achieve in it. Obviously, not every stage in a Mega Man game is built the same, so strats vary by a stage-by-stage basis, but I think it's just better for me to show you instead. Before I get into it though, just know that I typically practice a stage on an emulator first, as save states help me isolate certain sections to refine any maneuver or strategy. Then, once I'm all practiced up, I'll move the game to original hardware and record from there. In this case, I'm using the RetroArch emulator to practice on a 02 ROM. Then when I'm ready, I'll turn on my GameCube and pop the GBA cart into my Game Boy player. Let's take Fefner's stage from 02 for example, as I'm currently finalizing the strategy for his stage for my upcoming remastered run. I'll explain things as I go. The goal of Fefner's stage is simple: weave through the platforms as smoothly and quickly as possible. The moving platforms in this stage are on a global timer. If you don't know what that means, I won't bore you with the details. Just know that these platforms, along with the enemies in the entire stage, all move in their predetermined pattern off screen. The moment the first frame begins before Zero even teleports in. Right from the beginning, I'll present two strategies to start off the first section: Option A and Option B. Both of these will give me a slight variation in platform patterns. Let's start with Option A. As you saw, this one skull crushes downward, then carefully times a wall kick to maintain my speed. This option is all about going through as quickly to the best of my ability. The slightest pause or error can give me an undesirable pattern. Let me show you what I mean. Yeah, see, if I'm even the slightest bit off, that platform will pop my ass hard if I try to jump over it. And that's no good for me, because that means I'll have to slow down and dash under it, throwing off the cycle for the upcoming platforms. So at this point, I'm loading the save state repeatedly to practice consistency in my movement. The beginning of Fefner's stage is the most important, as it decides how the rest of the stage will flow. So let me show you how pretty much perfect execution would look like. Alright, so let's say I'm fed up with Option A's strictness and frame perfect movement. Well, I'll start looking for a compromise or some sort of variation in the strategy to give a bit of leeway for minor mistakes. Well, check this out. Even though my saber's maxed out at this point of the run, it still takes too long to freeze this problem child of a platform without the buster. And because of my minimal use of the Z buster rule, which I'll explain in this run's post-commentary video in the future, my buster isn't leveled up enough to grade 2 charge to make an exception to the rule, and charged chain rod holds Zero in place for far too long to be desirable, so that's where the X skill comes in to save the day. Sure, it's a small pace breaker, but it's still sweet to look at. Now, let's finally explore Option B. I want to try a different strategy for the beginning section, so here it is. By taking a slight speed loss, option B completely lowers the frequency of screw-ups. Leviathan's X skill is doing most of the work for me, and all I'm doing is just guiding Zero to where he needs to go. So let's take a look at what pattern the platforms give me now, as Zero's half falling speed from the X skill throws off the global timer a bit. See, this completely changes things. The problem platform is skipped entirely because my slight speed drop from earlier moved it down a bit off screen. But now the question remains, is this worth it? Well, let's take a look at the next set of platforms both options provide. I'm going to load two different save states here where I saved right after bypassing the problem platform. Here's option A's second set. See, there's a slight pause. I can either just wait this out for a sec, then proceed carefully like I just did, or be impatient and do this. Just looks cleaner and a hell of a lot more satisfying to both do and boost the entertainment value than just boringly dashing through at the bottom. Now, here's option B's second set. Right off the bat, the platforms are positioned in a way to allow safe passage quickly. Again, I could either just carefully go about my way like I did last time, or do what I just did and freeze a platform for a faster and cleaner passage. Or, if I want to be a little bit more extra, that one's a little harder to execute and doesn't really get you through any faster. If anything, it's a teensy bit slower because of the wall kick between the last two frozen platforms. However, for entertainment's sake, I'd be more inclined to go for the harder variant. It just feels more swagger and on brand for what this channel's all about. So when you weigh both options, the difficulty of execution doesn't really change all that much. If I go for option A, which is falling down the first vertical segment faster, I'll have a much harder beginning because it's so freaking easy to bump into a wall when I didn't want to, or wall slide just a few frames too late, or not wall kick in time, or even ram into an enemy by moving just a tad too far to the right. But by dealing with all of that, I'll have more effortless passage towards the second half of the stage. But if I go for option B, I've got a stress-free beginning, but a bit of a tricky maneuver to consider with those frozen platforms, if it's worth the trouble. And you see, since I'll be switching to original hardware after practice, I have to account for resets and the time it'll take for me to mash through all the text and loading to retry again. So whichever option that'll be more friendly to resets also factors into my decision. So here's what I do. I practice both options a considerable amount of time, and whichever one is the most consistent with execution, that's the one I'd go for. Do note that based on which stage I'm running and its general difficulty level, I may have more than two options, and this process is done for any other sections of the stage I feel may need to be isolated like this one. In Pfeffner's case, option B is the strategy I've mastered with a fairly higher success rate, so it's what I've decided. To illustrate this, let's hop over to my GameCube and I'll perform option B in full. Doing so, you'll see how my process is more about collecting pieces to solve a puzzle of my own design. For the game itself isn't forcing me to play like this, but executing it is worth it because it's all on brand, like I said earlier. My style is less about being the fastest and more about being stylish, even though I still value speed over most aspects. Now, I won't show off any more on the stage after this point. I've spoiled you enough as is. You'll see all of Pfeffner's stage in the run itself. But now this should at least give you a general idea of what I go through. It's why it takes so long on these, because I'm deconstructing each section of a stage to bend it to my particular style. Now, while I'm still here, let's address the controller for a bit since I know a lot of folks didn't watch my last video. Yeah, by the way, thanks for rubbing that in my face, YouTube. Very helpful. I'm sure I'll be asked about whether or not I'm using a GameCube controller for my run. No, I'm not. I'm using this third-party controller that's kind of a ripoff of the Hori Digital controller. That controller was optimized specifically for the Game Boy player. I don't have a Hori to compare the third parties, as trying to get that thing isn't cheap. It runs well over 130 US bucks on average. Yeah, I don't know about you, but that ain't worth it to me. So I did a bit of a Frankenstein experiment. I bought two third-party controllers, one made by Retrobit and another from Old School. Retrobit's controller is straight garbo, so let's just ignore that piece of shit. Old School almost passes as a decent controller out of the box, though it has its flaws. The D-pad, the L and R triggers, and their internal buttons are all just so bad. They're stiff and sometimes unresponsive, but everything else on the controller is perfection. Though if you look at my controller, it looks different from what the Old School's supposed to look. I'll probably have a picture on screen. Well, that's because I removed the D-pad, L and R triggers, and their internal buttons. I took a Super Famicom controller that I had in my closet. Its board is completely dead, so the parts were just ripe for the taking. Old School shell allows itself to fit in any OEM's SNES or Super Famicom controller's D-pad and shoulder buttons into it. And surprisingly, these Hori knockoffs all use the same inner rubber buttons as the SNES controllers. You know, these things. You have to open up the controller to actually see these, but yeah. Obviously the rubber is different for the rightmost face buttons, but everything else is fair game. I'm just lucky Old School pulled through with those buttons on the right, man, being great, unlike that piece of trash I just threw away. The only thing that slightly nags me is how loose this makes the L and R buttons now, though that's really just the clickiness that I'm nitpicking right now. It doesn't affect the inputs at all, and I got used to it fairly easily. I can't speak for anyone else, but after this slight modification, this provided me with the most comfortable Zero Series experience. So yeah, if you're willing to do a bit of swapping with an SNES or Super Famicom controller, I'd recommend buying an Old School if you have a GameCube and use your Game Boy player often like I do. It's real easy to do. You just grab a Phillips screwdriver or this nifty little bit set that I have right here. Forgive me with the camera being weirdly angled. This is the best I can do given my current situation. But yeah, you take a screwdriver or one of those bits and you take out these 5 screws. Then once you get that open, you pull open the shell and you remove the circuit board, and from there you should be able to pull out all of the internal buttons as well as the face buttons too, because all of this will kind of fall out once you open it up. But I'm not a repair tech channel. You can easily YouTube search how to open an SNES controller and go from there. Just know that I'm not liable for anything you might fuck up, so do this at your own risk. But yeah, that's it for me. Stay chill, y'all.